Alrighty, well it is 7 o'clock. I'm not one to wait around. Looks like we have Dan, 89, or excuse me, AB9TS, Dan, KD9OHQ, KC9HDS, KD9, ooh, somebody signed up. Is that us?
It's gone.
Okay. And W9LSE. Okay. Well, we are called to order. Normally during a regular business, not a business meeting, but a club meeting, any new members, it's the time where we introduce ourselves. And I'm not familiar with you, sir. If you would like to introduce yourself. I feel like Phil Donahue when I'm going to pass the mic.
This is Will Moss, KD9OUV, and I'm just here to see what types of things are being taught and see what I can learn.
Alrighty, thank you. Okay.
Welcome.
Well, yell at everybody. Maybe that'll get through. Anyway, my name is Sean, KD9KGQ, club president. I'm going to go around the room and let everybody introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Ken, W9GM. And I'm Drew, AB9NE.
Scott, KB3, MKD.
David, KB9EWG, Club Vice President.
Okay. Let's start off with you, Dan, introducing yourself and your call sign to our guest.
I'm Dan, 89TS. I've been a past board member and a member of the club for about 30 years now. Maybe you could tell us who the new person was?
I'm sorry,
Well,
well,
I'm talking, but I couldn't understand the words.
all right, you got another go around to introduce yourself.
The name is Will Moss, MAAS. Call sign is KD9OUV. I'm just here to see what's being taught and try to learn some new things, since I don't know very much yet.
Okay, did everybody get that? Will Moss, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Alrighty, Ron, your turn.
Okay, KD9OHQ, been a ham for 2 years, and got a cold right now, so that's it for.
All right, Bob, you're up.
I'm Bob, W9LNC. Been a member of the club and a ham since early in this century.
I think I've seen Steve, if I'm not mistaken, that might be Steve Kilmer, is that correct? Steve, if that's you, introduce yourself, please.
Muted.
Steve, I think you might be muted. Alrighty, well, we're waiting on Steve. Let's go to Wayne. I seen him pop up. Wayne, you're muted too. So, we had some introductions. Dan, I'm going to put you on the spot, if you're still there. You're the hand pledge guy. Could you lead us in the hand pledge?
Okay. I'm a ham,
I'm
I'm a ham.
and I can transmit
I can transmit
if I have to,
if I have to.
I guess.
I guess.
All right, now that silliness is over, we do have asking for a moment of silence for Paulette O'Brien, KB9QGC, Tom O'Brien's wife. She was a ham and a longtime club member, so we asked for a moment of silence in respect for her. Okay. I shouldn't fold up my agenda. Just wanted to announce some upcoming events. There's a VE session on Saturday, February 12th, for testing for general, technician, and extras. That's on the calendar. The next event coming up is the March 12th parade for St. Patty's Day in downtown La Crosse. Was going to put a sign-out sheet to the membership for those interested. Rick Coulter has agreed again this year to spearhead that. And next is the Wisconsin QSO party. I had it wrong by saying QSL, and Drew corrected me that this evening. That is on the following Sunday on March 13th. And I'm going to hand the mic to Drew for more details with regard to that.
Okay, the Wisconsin QSO party is coming up on March 14th, or the 13th rather, Sunday, March 13th, from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. local time. And like to put an effort into participating in that. Get a couple stations going. We don't yet have the details as to where we'll be set up, but there'll be more information forthcoming. So please mark your calendar.
Alrighty, thanks, Drew. At this point, we can entertain some any new business from the members at large. I will put it out there that we are currently looking for a new newsletter editor. Anybody willing to step up to that would be welcomed with open arms. There is a plan B, but was hoping to reach out to see if anybody would be interested in taking on that position. With that said, from the general membership, is there anything that you would like to bring to the meeting before we move on to the main attraction for this evening? Okay. Not hearing anything. Scott Cross, KV3MKD, will give us a presentation on Linux versus Windows. And I'll hand you the mic and let him take over.
Good evening. Let me try to bring up a little slideshow I got it going here. Well, we can start by sharing my screen. Would help. Let's see here. Screen. And then get the slideshow. Oh yeah, this thing's off to the side. There we go. All right. I've been using Linux for over 20 years. Started working with it, teaching it in an IT school. So I've seen a lot of changes over the years, so we're going to go take a look at some of the things. First of all, what is Linux? It's an operating system. Windows is also an operating system. What they do is they interface applications to the hardware. So the applications and the hardware have to meet somewhere, and the operating system is what brings that together. They control the access to the hardware. and they handle multitasking. So when you can run multiple programs at the same time, that's multitasking. And they both provide what's called a GUI, graphical user interface. Technically, Linux actually offers several, but that's a different issue anyway. One of the features of Linux is there's multiple distributions, which means if you don't like it one way, you can always find another way to make it work. These multiple distributions run what's called software repositories. Software repositories is basically a collection of software that's already set up and made compatible with that particular distribution of Linux. And you can go there and install whatever it is you like, and most applications are supported right in that repository, and it's already compatible. So that's a nice feature of it. There's a lot of options, sometimes too many options. So you can get overwhelmed on the options if you like. You can twist Linux around and do all kinds of things. Linux is used on some of the smallest computers and some of the biggest big iron you ever see. The big mainframe computers running Linux as we call a bunch of computers. I forget the term. When you put all kinds of computers put together. Supercomputers, yeah, there's a term for it when you actually link them up that way though. One of the advantages of Windows. There are some advantages for Windows, particularly if you're into certain applications. If your Microsoft Word is not available in Linux. Adobe software is not available in Linux. High-end gaming is generally not available in Linux. Well, that's starting to change now too. User familiarity with Windows. Most people are familiar with Windows. They've used it at work, they've used it at school, and so you're already familiar with it. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, all those options in Linux can be overwhelming. There's so many of them, so you can get confused with that. So here's your advantage. There's a few advantages for Windows, but advantages of Linux: ownership of your computer. With Windows, you're leasing the operating system. Microsoft still owns it, and they have access to your computer. And this is one of the biggest reasons why people switch to Linux nowadays, is because they want control over their own computer. Have you ever been in the middle of something and Windows decided to update? Right in the middle of what you're doing. I was one time doing a presentation, and Windows decided to update right in the middle. And of course, update means reboot. Somebody needs to be muted. Okay, so when you do that, another advantage of Linux, when you go to update, it updates all your software, not just your operating system. With Windows, if you have Adobe software on, you go through Adobe's process to update their software, you go through Microsoft process to update their software. With Linux, you can update it all at once, one place, because they're using the repositories that handles all that for you. Because of these repositories, you don't have to go through much to install an application. You simply, a couple of clicks, it installs itself right in your operating system. It's very easy to work with. One of the things that people complain about Linux in the past, compiling your own software, that's a thing of the past. So many of the applications, Windows has some applications that Linux doesn't. Many of the applications for Windows do have a Linux version, or at the very least, there's something else that will do the job. But it may not do it the way you want to, so it's up to you whether you want to go with Linux or Windows. So there's replacement applications available. Okay, less overhead. One of the issues with Linux is you can put it on an older computer and it'll run just as well, better than Windows, faster, because there's just less overhead. There's bloat in Windows that just isn't there in Linux. Linux is more secure unless you're in like a domain environment. If you're setting up a Linux box at home, it's not as secure as a Linux box would be. there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is the way, a lot of it is the way Linux works underneath the hood. It just is built more secure right from the ground up. If you put Windows in a domain environment, it does add a whole lot of security to it. So that advantage of Linux tends to go away in that environment. One of the myths about Linux is it's hard to use. This is the reasons for that is it used to be harder to use. You had to go to the command line interface to do almost anything. And type in a command. And there's all kinds of little arcane switches and options that you'd have to put on the command line interface to make the whole thing work. But that's no longer true. You can go through Linux for a year and never use the command line, just like in Windows. And nowadays, Windows even has a command line of its own anyway. In fact, they took it out for a little while, they had to put it back in. One of the myths is that hardware doesn't work with Linux because of driver issues. That is no longer the case. It is actually easier to get your Linux to work and the drivers are built right into the kernel. It's easier to get Linux to work with drivers, and I've installed Windows a few times and found driver issues with that, and I find less driver issues now with Linux. It's surprising, but that's true. All right, ham radio. Ham radio. Most ham radio applications are available in Linux. A few do require replacement. Last I heard, I haven't checked lately, but last I heard our logging software, W3FJP. Did I get that right?
N3FJP?
N3FJP, yeah, that's the one. That one is not available in Linux. The last I heard, Scott was not making that available. But most other things are. WSJT, all your computer modes,
FLDigi, yeah.
FLDigi, those are all supported by Linux.
And there are Linux logging software.
There is other Linux logging software. You just can't use N3FJP.
Right.
Okay. If you want to get into Linux, there's some really inexpensive ways to do it. One of those is called the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi is a small little computer that runs Linux. You know, it costs under $100. And then you add it even comes without a case. You just put a little case in it, and away you go. Let me do something here. Minimize that. I can't. Oh, come on. This is Raspberry Pi interface right here. We actually have a Raspberry Pi up here underneath the counter. I can get access to, I'm accessing it through my laptop, and you can see we have all kinds of applications, and here's some ham radio applications that are available. FLDigi, gpredict, WSJTX, those are all available. There's a bunch more. I don't have a whole lot installed on this particular Pi, but so there's plenty of applications available for Linux, even in the Raspberry Pi. But if you want to try something else, you just get an old computer, and you can put on any of several other Linux operating systems. Ubuntu, Mint, and Pop OS are all good choices for beginners. But whatever you do, don't get into the weeds. As I said earlier, there are a lot of options in Linux. You can change all kinds of things up. You can change the way things look. You can move all kinds of stuff around. And if you're just starting out, you don't want to do that. You really don't want to do that, because that'll drive you away and drive you nuts, and you won't know how to get back to where you were. So there's a few good choices there. Are there any questions?
Well, Microsoft is the one that does Windows. Is Linux a corporation, or is this who updates the
Okay.
operating system?
Linux was originally developed as a kernel by a guy named Linus Torvalds out of Finland. And what's happened is he's made this kernel available to everybody, and you can even look at the source code, update, change it all you want. Can't do that with Microsoft Windows. But then other organizations have jumped in and taken this kernel, put a bunch of utilities around it, and that's what we call a distribution of Linux. So it'll be all the software you want for this particular distribution. Ubuntu, Pop! OS, Mint, Fedora, Cinnamon. There's a whole bunch of different distributions of Linux available for various organizations, and so that's what you're looking at.
Yeah. There's Linus Torvalds, like he said, develops the kernel, and he's still involved in updating it. That's a full-time job itself. They've got a lot of people involved in that.
Hundreds.
There are other big corporations that do their own operating systems that use the Linux kernel.
Okay. So how, do you have to pay for this software, like Windows, or?
Actually, even Windows is now free.
Okay.
But yeah, because of Linux, it's become so popular in many ways that Microsoft can't compete. So they're actually dropping their prices to the point where you can put on Windows for free.
Okay.
Linux has always been free. It always has been. Office you still have to pay for, but even that, the prices have been dropping because there's other software that's out there. LibreOffice is a very famous example of that one. That basically it's a replacement for Microsoft Office. It does not work exactly the same. It doesn't have the same look and feel. So, but it will do pretty much anything that Office does for the most part. There's a few things that Office will do that, some of their programming backend. They used to have their basic for Office, and you can actually program stuff in there. Yeah, you don't have that. That will not work with LibreOffice, but but Office prices come down because of Linux.
And now that you have Office 365 online, you can use that in Linux.
Okay.
So you can use Microsoft Office while you're in Linux, but it would be the online version. You wouldn't have it native on your computer.
Okay. So you said you were talking about the domain, the Linux might have more issues when you're out in the domain. Were you referring to like out on the internet, or what do you mean by the domain?
No, in a domain environment, I'm talking about Windows.
Okay.
Okay, a corporate environment for Windows runs what they call a domain.
Okay.
And there's a lot of extra security stuff that's involved in building that domain so that your corporation is safe from all kinds of whatever malware and other attacks that can happen. Linux does not have those. That can't. Well, it does. There's a lot of networking stuff you can do within a corporate environment, within a domain. But when you're outside the domain, is where Windows is much more vulnerable, and Linux is not.
Okay.
So a domain environment makes Windows a lot more safe, but if you're not in that domain environment, if you're at your house, you're not going to be a domain environment. Unless you're in a corporate domain environment, you're probably going to be a lot more vulnerable from Windows.
Okay. And one of the IT guys I worked with, he ran Linux on his personal computer. And one of the reasons that he told me at the time, and this has been probably 5 or 6 years ago, he has less issues with viruses. Is that a correct statement, or?
Yeah, there aren't really no viruses at all.
Okay.
The viruses you might find in Linux would be basically like a Java-based or an email-based kind of thing, but then if there's any specific operating system code at all, it's going to be Windows.
Okay.
You're not going to find operating system specific viruses for Linux.
Okay.
So Linux might be vulnerable if you're running like a Java script, something or other. That's a possibility.
So when you download this operating system, I mean, at least with Microsoft, you know, you got a corporation that's standing behind that. It doesn't sound like there's any corporation with Linux standing by the software. That how do you know that you're not getting a rogue software?
First of all, there are a number of organizations that are standing behind Linux. Each one standing behind its own distribution, of course.
Okay.
But what you're getting with those software repositories is a safe place to get your software.
Okay.
It's already been checked. There's no malware in it. There's just a bunch of software that's already been confirmed compatible with that particular distribution. Makes it a lot safer. You do all your updates in the same place. That, to me, is probably the biggest advantage of Linux, is the software repositories.
Was that one of the Mint I think I saw on the screen? Was that one of the repositories, or you had 4 different ones?
Well, those are all different distributions.
Distributions.
Distributions. Okay. Each distribution has its own repository.
Okay.
So Raspbian, which is what you use with the Raspberry Pi, has a repository of software that's confirmed compatible with the Raspberry Pi and with the Raspbian operating system, which is a Linux-based Linux distribution. Ubuntu, Pop! OS, Fedora, Mint, all of these are just different distributions, and each one has its own repository. Okay, a lot of these distributions are based on each other, so they share a lot of the stuff. So if you get for Ubuntu or Mint, you can use each other's repositories because they are based on the same Debian-based Linux distribution.
Okay.
Other distributions might be based on a different setup. There's 2 major distribution types. There's the Red Hat type and there's the Debian type. But Ubuntu, Pop! OS, and Mint are all Debian-based.
Okay.
So is Raspbian, by the way. Any other questions? Anybody coming out from the Zoom session? Stop share. Here we go. Any questions from the Zoom participants?
Scott, I have a question. This is Ron.
Okay.
You said that you could start with an old computer.
Yes.
What would the first steps be? Would you reformat the hard drive?
Yes, you would have to reformat the hard drive. Actually, when you install the operating system, it will actually reformat for you.
Okay.
So it'll set up the hard drive in all Linux type of setup. So you don't have to worry about reformatting the hard drive directly. You just let the installation program do it.
And what about storage capacity? Does Linux require as many gigabytes of storage as Microsoft?
Actually, I would say
OS
it would require less because there's less bloat in it in the first place, both in terms of memory and in terms of storage. But again, any additional software you install has its own requirements. But most Linux applications are smaller than their equivalent Windows applications.
So some Linux distributions are geared towards older equipment, and they take less memory. That you were asking about the amount of memory it needs, and because they're smaller, they use less resources. It'll operate quicker, and it'll work better on that old equipment. An example of that would be a distribution called Lubuntu, which is a lightweight variant of Ubuntu. And there are a number of different distributions like that are geared towards older equipment. And they're all perfectly capable of running word processors, all the software that we're talking about. It's just that the operating system will be lighter and more responsive.
It generally basically cuts down some of the graphical user interface features when you use that. So you'll get the majority of it. You just want to have some of the extra stuff with your graphical user interface with a lightweight distribution. Raspberry itself is a lightweight distribution.
And you just, for your internet access, I mean, you use, what would you use for that? I mean,
Well,
not internet.
it's the same thing. You use either a wired internet, or a wired network, or wireless, either way. In fact, the Raspberry Pi actually has both of those available.
I mean, like, do you use Firefox for the?
Oh, you can use Firefox, you can use Google Chrome, you can use all kinds of different things. There are also several browsers that are for Linux. There's one called Conqueror, which works with a particular variant of the graphical user interface called KDE. What's other ones are out there?
There's one called Chromium, which is an open-based version of Chrome.
Right.
There's Opera and Vivaldi are both available on Windows and Mac, and they're on Linux. There's one called Brave, which has been kind of popular lately. So there are a number of them, and if you load a distribution of Linux on your computer, most of them will have a software store in them, and you can go into that software store and pick whatever you want, and it's all free to download.
Okay.
And that's your access to the repository that Scott was talking about. You can and that's all through a graphical user interface, or once you get used to using a command line, you can load it that way.
Any more questions?
What about dual booting?
I have a laptop, but not this one here. I have another laptop at home that I have dual booted Windows 11 and Linux Mint. So yes, you can dual boot. That brings up another point. There's actually a type of Linux comes into Microsoft Windows now. It's called Windows Subsystem for Linux, WSL. I don't generally recommend it. It's pretty much command line only. They're now just come out with where they can actually run some of the graphical software, but it doesn't run particularly well. But you can get your feet wet a little bit with Linux using that.
When you say the command line, is like back in the 80s when you typed in all the commands, or whatever?
Yeah, pretty much.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, it's not great. They're getting it, but it's getting better. So maybe in another year or so, they may have it may be a lot better.
Okay.
But right now, it's not there. It's not even close. But Linux is often used as an underlying virtual machine, so you can run different types of software on a Linux machine using virtual machines, and you can run Windows in Linux that way too. It's all virtual machines.
When you say a virtual machine, what do you
Well, basically, you have Windows running within Linux, or even Macintosh software running within Linux.
Okay.
There's versions where you can run Windows within a Mac. So, and some of that stuff actually works better than trying to run Linux within Windows, because like I said, Linux subsystem for Windows is not there yet.
It makes like an artificial computer within your computer that you can run any other operating system on.
Oh.
Within that.
So you can run something that will not run on Linux otherwise.
Yeah, trying to run Windows within Linux is a rather difficult thing to do. It's not something that's for the faint of heart. So if you're just new to Linux, don't try doing that one right away. That'll be getting into the weeds pretty quick.
And is it because of the size that a lot of was it Arduino? Is that?
Arduino is not. Arduino is a microcontroller. It does not run an operating system at all.
Okay.
Arduino is a device you put together to do a specific function.
Okay.
So it doesn't run applications or anything like that.
Raspberry Pis do run Linux, so
Yeah.
they can do a lot, they're a lot more capable than an Arduino. Well, if no more questions, I'm gonna turn this back over to Sean.
All righty. All righty, well, hopefully we've all learned a little bit. I knew nothing about Linux other than talking with the IT guy years ago. Thank you, Scott, for giving this presentation. And I guess we'll bring up next month's program. We intend to have Dan Goltz, hoping I'm saying his last name correctly, from the Winona Club, and he's going to give a presentation on how his club, the Winona Club, handles the Ride to Ridges, coordinates the hams involved in the communication aspect of that. I was involved in it last year, my first time, and I was amazed at the amount of coordination his club has in coordinating that event over such a wide area. With that, I'll ask for any comments before we close the meeting. Does anybody have any further comments or questions?
Thanks for your patience while we figured out the sound, guys.
Exactly. Thank you
Oh,
very
yeah,
much.
Absolutely.
Alrighty. With that said, we will now adjourn.
Might want to mention this, what we put on YouTube eventually too.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we have David. He's been videoing the meeting for us, and he's going to put it on YouTube for us. So anybody that wasn't able to attend tonight should be able to watch that as well. With that said, we are now adjourned.